She has nothing left to offer. That is the truth. And Sabrina knows it the way she knows the weight of her father's debts. Not as numbers, but as a pressure behind the sternum that never fully lifts. She did not choose to come here. The crown's collectors chose her. 3 weeks since they arrived at the door. 3 weeks since they inventoried everything her father had left behind and found it insufficient. 3 weeks later, a man with ink-stained fingers looked at her across her father's empty table and said, "The remaining balance will be settled in labor." She had not been asked. She had been written down. So now she stands in the throne room of King Vaelric Thorne, the Obsidian King, the sovereign of 5 conquered territories, the man whose name is used in this kingdom the way other kingdoms use the word winter, and she is being assessed the way one assesses a tool. Quickly. Without particular interest. The king sits above her on a throne that looks less like furniture and more like something dragged out of a war. He is younger than she expected. More beautiful than anyone with that much cold in their eyes has any right to be. He has not looked at her face once. He is reading the ledger. Voss debt. Settled by service. Swing. Kitchen rotation. He closes the ledger. Take her to the servant quarters, he says. Not to her. To the man beside him. She is not worth a direct address. That should be the end of it. The guard moves toward her. She turns. She is already preparing herself for the particular erasure of becoming just another body in a corridor, when the sound stops her. Not a growl exactly. Something older than a growl. Something that comes from a place before language, before kingdoms, before the particular human invention of deciding who matters and who does not. Draevor has moved. No one in the room breathes. She had seen him when she entered. Of course she had. It is not possible to stand in a room with Draevor and not see him. He had been motionless beside the throne, obsidian black and enormous, the kind of enormous that recalibrates your understanding of what a living thing can be. 8.5 feet of ancient, sovereign stillness. She had made the immediate and instinctive decision not to look directly at him, the way one decides not to look directly at fire. But he had moved. And he had moved toward her. He circles her once. Fully. The ground registers his weight. The dust shifts. His eyes, molten gold, lit from somewhere within, ancient and terrifyingly aware, find her face and do not leave it. He stops breathing. She is quite certain she is about to die. He does not touch her. He simply stops. Between her and the guard. Between her and the door. Between her and whatever the king just decided she was. He stands at her side like he has always been there. Draevor. The king's voice moves through the room like cold iron. A voice accustomed to ending things. Draevor does not move. The silence in the throne room is the particular kind that happens when something impossible occurs in front of witnesses. When the architecture of a world that everyone understood reveals a door that was never supposed to be there. Sabrina looks at the beast. The beast looks back at her. His gold eyes hold something she does not have a word for. Not aggression. Not hunger. Something that feels incomprehensibly like recognition. Behind her, she hears the king rise from his throne for the first time. And the entire court holds its breath, wondering the same thing. Why would the sovereign beast, bound by ancient compact to one master, who has never in living memory acted outside his king's will, refuse a direct command? For her. For a girl with dirt on her hem and a dead man's debt and no name worth knowing in a room like this. Vaelric Thorne descends the steps slowly. He stops in front of her. This close, his eyes are the color of a blade held to winter light, and they are, for the first time since she entered this room, looking directly at her face. He does not look away. She has nothing left to lose by meeting them. What are you? He says. Quietly. It is not a question meant for her. Draevor's gold eyes glow. Nobody answers. They gave her a room that no one seemed to know the name of. Not the servant quarters. Those were in the lower west wing, and the steward had started toward them out of habit before stopping, recalculating, casting a sideways look at Draevor and then redirecting without explanation. Not a guest chamber. Those were reserved for people the king intended to acknowledge. What Sabrina received was something in between. A room near the east tower, stone-walled and adequately furnished, the kind of space that suggested it had been used before for situations the court preferred not to categorize. She did not complain. She had not been asked. Draevor followed her to the door. She turned to look at him, at the sheer impossible scale of him filling the corridor, and understood without anyone telling her that he would not be coming inside. He lowered himself to the floor in front of her door instead, settled his massive head onto his forelegs, and closed his eyes with the finality of something that had already made its decision and did not require further discussion. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "All right," she said, to no one in particular. She went inside. She did not sleep well. She was aware the entire night of the weight of him just beyond the door, not as a threat, but as something stranger and harder to name. Constant. A presence that had apparently decided she was its concern and had not bothered to explain why. By morning the court had opinions. She could hear it in the quality of the silence when she moved through corridors. The way conversations didn't stop. They adjusted, recalibrated, continued at a slightly different angle. She was being discussed the way courts discuss things they cannot yet afford to say aloud. Draevor walked beside her. The corridor cleared. The summons came before midday. No preamble, no stated reason. Just a servant at her door with the particular expression of someone delivering a message they found confusing. "The king will see you." He was standing when she entered. Not at the throne, beside the window, arms crossed, the winter light doing nothing to soften him. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at maps before a campaign. Searching for something specific, cataloging what he found, revealing nothing about whether he'd located it. He did not offer her a seat. She did not ask for one. The silence stretched long enough that she understood he had not summoned her to speak. He had summoned her to look. To search her face for whatever Draevor had seen in the throne room and find, if he could, a rational explanation for it. Whatever he was looking for, he did not find it. She watched him not find it. She watched something flicker behind those steel-gray eyes. Not warmth, nothing so approachable as warmth, but something closer to the frustration of a man who has never encountered a problem he could not solve by looking at it harder. "You may go," he said finally. She went. In the corridor outside, half concealed by the turn of the wall, Lady Saravin stood with her hands folded and her expression perfectly composed. She watched Sabrina pass. She did not smile. The court did not need weapons. It had architecture. Sabrina learned this in the first week. Not from any single incident. Nothing so clean as that, but from the accumulation of small, precise exclusions that, assembled together, formed a structure as deliberate and load-bearing as the palace walls themselves. A chair pulled slightly away from a table when she approached. A conversation that did not pause to include her. A servant who looked at a point just past her left shoulder and waited patiently for her to stop speaking before continuing as though the air had made a noise. None of it was accidental. Accidents have edges. These were smooth. Saravin's influence, she was beginning to understand, did not require Saravin's presence. It had been distributed throughout the court the way cold distributes through stone, gradually, thoroughly, until it simply was the temperature of everything. The lady herself moved through the palace with the ease of someone who had long since stopped needing to manage things directly. She had only to have managed them already. Sabrina did not fight it. She was not sure fighting was even the correct concept. You do not fight a current by throwing yourself against it. You watch it. You learn where it runs fastest and where it eddies, and you remember and you wait. She watched. Draevor walked beside her through all of it. Through the dining hall where space materialized around her with suspicious convenience, isolating her at one end of a long table. Through the library where a noble lady gathered her books and relocated without acknowledgement. Through the courtyard where a group of attendants parted to let her pass and closed again behind her like water, their voices resumed before she had cleared earshot. He did not react to any of it. He simply remained. Steady and enormous and indifferent to the court's opinion in the particular way that only something ancient and undefeatable can afford to be indifferent. His presence did not stop the cruelties. But it surrounded them, contained them, kept them from metastasizing into something that left marks. She was grateful for this. He did not say so. She suspected he did not need to be told. Vaelric did not intervene. He told himself on the third day that it was not his concern. She was a debt settlement. A complication Draevor had created. The court would calibrate to her presence eventually or it would not, and either outcome was irrelevant to the functioning of the kingdom. He told himself this on the fourth day also. On the fifth day he was crossing the upper corridor when movement in the courtyard below caught his eye. Sabrina, crossing the open ground alone. Draevor beside her, the space around her carefully, pointedly empty. Her chin was level. Her pace was even. She gave nothing away to anyone watching. He stayed at the window longer than he intended. When he turned away, he did not examine why. The storm arrived without diplomacy. One moment the sky was the usual flat gray of late afternoon, and the next the rain was horizontal and the corridor torches were guttering and the fastest route back to the East Tower was no longer a reasonable option. Sabrina ducked into the nearest covered passage and stopped. Vaelric was already there. He had clearly arrived moments before her. His cloak was damp at the shoulders, his hair carrying the particular disorder of wind rather than intention. He looked at her with the expression she was becoming familiar with. Not quite annoyance, not quite something else, residing in the uncomfortable territory between them. Neither of them left. The rain made that decision for them. For a while there was only the sound of it, the hard driving percussion against stone, the distant complaint of a shutter torn loose somewhere in the east wing. Draevor sat between them with his eyes half closed, apparently unbothered by the weather, apparently unbothered by everything, in the manner of something that had outlasted worse. It was Vaelric who spoke first. She had not expected that. You haven't tried to use it. He was not looking at her. His eyes were on the rain. The bond. You haven't attempted to leverage it. Not with me, not with the court. Pause. Why not? It was not entirely a question. It was the shape of something he had been turning over privately and had finally, reluctantly, decided to say aloud. Sabrina considered the rain for a moment. She had learned, in the weeks since arriving, that this court rewarded performance, that every sentence spoken in these corridors carried subtext, implication, the careful architecture of wanting something. She did not know how to do that. She had never had enough to make it worth learning. I didn't ask for it, she said. I don't understand it. And I don't want anything from you. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silences before it. She watched him process the answer, watched something move behind his eyes that she could not fully read. Not softening. Nothing so available as softening. More like the expression of a man who has prepared extensively for a negotiation and arrived to find the other party has no demands. It left him with no leverage and no script and apparently nowhere to put either hand. It infuriated him. She could see that plainly. Not because it was offensive, but because it was true. Because it was the only answer that could not be manufactured and he knew it, and knowing it did not help him at all. He said nothing further. After a moment he turned and walked back into the rain without his cloak fully adjusted, which struck her as the most human thing she had seen him do. She looked at Draevor. Draevor watched the king's retreating figure with his molten gold eyes carrying an expression that Sabrina would later struggle to describe to herself accurately. Patient, she would finally decide. He looked patient. Like something that already knew how the story ended and was simply waiting without urgency for everyone else to arrive there. Her father had not left her much. A worn traveling coat. A journal with more blank pages than written ones. A small knife with a handle wrapped in cord that had been rewrapped so many times the original material was unidentifiable. These were the things the collectors had not considered worth taking, which was its own kind of inventory. A list of what a life amounted to when measured by people who measured everything. At the bottom of the traveling coat's inner pocket, stitched into the lining rather than stored inside it, she found the medallion. Small. Older than old. Not in the way of things that had aged, but in the way of things that had always been ancient, as though they arrived into the world already carrying the weight of centuries. The metal was dark and unreflective, the sigil pressed into its face unlike anything she had seen before. Not the thorn crest. Not any territorial marking she recognized. Something that preceded all of that. Something that felt, when she held it, less like an object and more like a word in a language she did not speak but somehow almost understood. She did not know why her father had hidden it. She did not know why, looking at it, the back of her neck felt cold. She took it to the archivist. The court's archive occupied a long room in the north wing that smelled of old paper and careful preservation. The archivist was a small, precise man who had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades among documents and absorbed their stillness. He looked at the medallion she placed before him the way one looks at something one has only ever encountered in text. Then the color left his face. It was not gradual. It was immediate. A subtraction. Where did you get this, he said. Not with curiosity. With something closer to the tone people use when they already know the answer and are hoping to be contradicted. My father left it, she said. Can you tell me what the sigil means? He slid it back across the table toward her. His hands, she noticed, did not linger on it. "I can't help you," he said. "I'm sorry." He was not sorry. He was afraid. She picked up the medallion and left. That night she woke to the particular quality of silence that is not empty, the kind with a shape inside it. She lay still and listened. The room was dark. Nothing moved. Draevor outside her door made no sound. But in the morning she knew. The small displacements that only register if you are someone accustomed to having very little and therefore knowing precisely where all of it lies. Her father's journal angled slightly differently. The coat folded along a different crease. The knife moved 2 inches to the left. Nothing taken. Everything was examined. She sat on the edge of her bed with the medallion in her closed fist and understood that she had asked a question she could not unask. Across the palace, Saravin set down a glass of wine and reached for a different set of documents entirely. Her movements, always composed, carried a new quality tonight. Urgency, carefully dressed as calm. He did not send for her this time. That was the difference, and she noticed it immediately. The absence of a servant at her door, the absence of formal language, the absence of the particular machinery that Vaelric seemed to require around all his movements to keep them from resembling anything as ungoverned as choice. He simply appeared in the doorway of the East Library, saw her at the table by the far window, and after a pause that lasted just long enough to suggest he was considering leaving, walked in and sat across from her. He did not explain himself. He did not ask him to. She had not been reading. The book was open in front of her, but she had stopped seeing it some time ago, her mind elsewhere, turning the medallion's sigil over and over in the space behind her eyes. She closed the book. He glanced at the cover without comment. The first few minutes were silence of the negotiating kind, both of them waiting, neither willing to establish the terms. Then he said something about the library's organizational system, a dry observation about the archivist's preference for chronology over subject, and she responded, and somehow that was enough to open a door that neither of them had formally agreed to walk through. They talked for 2 hours. Not about anything that mattered on the surface. The kingdom's early history, the disputed accounts of the Third Territorial War, the particular inadequacy of debt law as it applied to inherited obligation. Her father, she mentioned him carefully, a few words at a time, testing the weight of it. And Vaelric listened in a way she had not seen him listen before, without the performance of patience, without the underlying current of waiting for information he could use. Just listening. At some point she told him the mountains in her home region turned the color of old copper in winter, and he was quiet for a moment and then said that the mountains visible from the North Tower turned silver. As though the exchange of that detail was unremarkable. As though they were simply 2 people in a room. When he left, he did not acknowledge that any of it had happened. He stood, said nothing that referenced the previous 2 hours, and walked out. She sat for a moment in the shape of the conversation, which still occupied the room in the way warmth lingers after a fire is banked. She did not sleep restlessly that night. That too was a difference. In the morning, a steward arrived before breakfast with the information that her quarters had been reassigned. The new room was closer to the main wing. It had a window that faced the courtyard rather than the wall. No explanation was offered. She did not receive one. 3 corridors away, Saravin learned of the relocation before the morning's first bell. She stood at her window for a long moment, perfectly still, the particular stillness of someone revising a timeline. Then she sent a message to a name she had not written down in 3 years. Saravin chose a morning when the full court was assembled. This was not a coincidence. Nothing Saravin did was a coincidence. The timing was architectural. A session already scheduled, every noble already present, the room already arranged in the particular formation that ensured maximum witness. She had simply waited for the correct morning the way one waits for the correct light, and when it arrived she walked into the throne hall with a composure so absolute it functioned as its own accusation. The jewelry, she explained to the court, had been a gift. Rare. Irreplaceable. A piece with personal significance that she would not detail publicly out of discretion. A detail that ensured everyone imagined something more significant than she needed to claim. It had gone missing 3 days prior. She had conducted a quiet internal search before troubling anyone. She was deeply reluctant to raise the matter at all. The search of Sabrina's room had, she said with precisely calibrated regret, produced it. The room absorbed this. Sabrina stood near the back, having arrived at the session unaware. Another architectural choice she understood now, the ambush framed as coincidence. and felt the court's attention move to her in the smooth, unified way of a tide finding a new direction. She did not speak. There was no version of speaking that helped here. Saravin had not built this to be argued with. It was not an accusation that invited defense. It was a shape, carefully constructed, and any response she gave would simply become part of the shape. She looked at Vaelric. He was on the throne. His expression was the one she knew, controlled, unreadable, the face of a man who had spent decades ensuring that nothing happening inside him was visible from the outside. He met her eyes for one moment, and said nothing. The silence was total. The kind that does not merely represent absence of sound but actively communicates something, fills the room with it, makes everyone present a witness to what it means. She watched him not speak and understood, with a clarity that was almost impersonal, that whatever had happened in the East Library 2 weeks ago did not exist in this room. Could not exist in this room. He had built too much around the requirement of his own impassivity, and she was not enough, had never been enough, would never be enough, to make him dismantle it publicly. She did not beg. She did not explain. She held his gaze for one more second so he would know she had seen exactly what she was seeing, and then she turned and walked from the hall. The sound of her footsteps was very clear in the silence. Then a second sound. The measured, heavy tread of something enormous rising from beside the throne. The court parted before Draevor without needing to be asked. He crossed the hall and followed her through the doors without looking back. The doors closed. Vaelric sat alone on his throne in a room full of people, and it was the most alone he had felt in 20 years. He found her in the east courtyard just before midnight. She was sitting on the low stone ledge that ran along the inner wall, not doing anything in particular, just occupying the dark with the particular stillness of someone who had finished being upset and arrived at something quieter and more permanent on the other side of it. Draevor was beside her. The courtyard was empty of everyone else. Vaelric stopped a few feet away. He did not sit. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at a point just past her shoulder in the manner of a man approaching something he had not prepared adequate language for and was only now fully registering that fact. She did not make it easier for him. She waited. The jewelry was not stolen, he said finally. Saravin had it moved. I have the name of the servant she used. I have not yet determined what else she has arranged, or how far back the arrangements go. Sabrina said nothing. She was listening in the way she listened, completely without performance, without the small sounds people make to indicate their attention. Just receiving. He told her more than he had planned to. He was aware of this as it was happening and continued anyway, the way one continues down a slope, not because stopping is impossible but because stopping has begun to feel like the less honest option. Saravin's influence in the court. The years of it, the patience of it, the way it had been woven into the fabric of the palace so gradually that he had not seen it as construction but simply as weather. His suspicions about the archivist's sudden unavailability. The name in the old documents that he had encountered twice now in contexts that should not have intersected. He did not say her father's name. He was not ready for that conversation. But he stood at the edge of it. When he stopped talking, the courtyard was very quiet. The kind of quiet that follows something that cannot be untold. Sabrina looked at him for a moment. Her expression was not warm and it was not cold. It was simply clear. The particular clarity of someone who has stopped performing anything and is only looking at what is actually there. Why are you telling me this now? She said. After. Instead of before. Instead of during. He had no answer. He had known walking here that this question was waiting at the end of whatever he said, and he had come anyway and he still did not have an answer. There was something that might eventually become one. Something unformed and structurally unsound that lived in the vicinity of the East Library and 2 hours about mountains, but he could not yet build it into a sentence that didn't collapse under its own weight. He said nothing. Draevor settled between them in the dark, his warm bulk a constant between two people who were, for the first time, not performing anything for each other's benefit or the court's or their own. The silence this time was different from all the others. It was honest. Quietly, uncomfortably, irreversibly honest. And none of the three of them moved to end it. Saravin requested a private audience on Tuesday, which was deliberate. Tuesdays were administrative days. The court dispersed into its various functions, the halls thinned, conversations conducted in the council wing carried less risk to the audience. She had chosen the day the way she chose everything. Without visible effort, the selection invisible inside the mundane. Vaelric received her in the small study off the north corridor rather than the throne room. She noted this without reacting. He was being careful too then. Good. Careful people conducted cleaner conversations. She did not sit when offered. She stood, hands folded, and laid it out the way one lays out a map, without drama, without embellishment, simply revealing the terrain as it existed. She had found the severance clause in the original compact texts. She named the archive, the volume, the page, demonstrating that this was not interpretation but documentation. The clause was old, older than the current Thorne line, written into the compact at its inception by people who had apparently anticipated the possibility of a bond forming outside the intended parameters. The language was precise. The ritual was documented. It required the bloodline, the bond, and the willing hand of the one who held the compact. Then she told him what Sabrina's bloodline meant. She watched his face as she did it and gave him credit. He absorbed it without visible fracture. Only the slight tension along his jaw betrayed that the information had landed with any weight at all. She is a destabilizing element, Saravin said. Not unkindly. That was the craft of it. She had always been better at damage when she sounded reasonable. The cord is already fractured. The bond is already being discussed beyond these walls. If it continues, the political consequences are not recoverable. I can resolve this quietly. Completely. He would not suffer. She let that sit. I am offering you the clean version, she said. Before circumstances require the less clean one. Vaelric looked at her for a long moment. His face was the face she had known for years. Controlled, opaque. The face that had never given her anything she had not already calculated for. Give me 2 days, he said. She nodded and left, satisfied. 2 days was a concession. Concessions meant the argument had reached him. She had what she needed. She did not tell him the ritual had already been prepared. Sabrina woke at the 3rd hour of the night to something she had no name for. Not a sound. Not a dream. Something wrong in a register beneath both. A frequency she felt in her sternum, in the back of her teeth, in the place where she was only now understanding. The bond had quietly taken up residence without her permission. Draevor was not outside her door. She stood in her doorway and felt the wrongness pulling northwest toward the old tower, the one the servants moved around rather than through. Toward something vast and struggling and unmistakably his. She went. She did not think carefully about this decision. There was not, in that moment, any other decision available to her. The tower door was open. The dark inside it was the kind that had been arranged. She walked in. He knew before he reached the tower. Not because anyone told him, no one had, but because the compact was old and ran deeper than logic, and somewhere in the hours since Saravin had left his study something had shifted in the architecture of it, a wrongness spreading through the palace the way cold spreads through stone. He had been awake already. He was moving before he fully understood why. He heard it as he took the stairs. Old language, spoken in the particular cadence of ritual. Not conversational, not incidental, but deliberate in the way of things that intend to be permanent. Saravin's voice, unhurried, each syllable placed with the care of someone who has rehearsed and is now simply completing what was always going to happen. He came through the door. The room was lit by something that was not on fire. Saravin stood at its center, composed, the documents open before her, her expression carrying the mild focus of someone finishing necessary work. Draevor was against the far wall. Not unconscious but held, the ritual's architecture pressing against the bond with a weight that had forced him to his knees. It was the first time Sabrina had ever seen him reduced to anything, and the sight of it, that ancient sovereign creature brought low, was more frightening than the magic itself. Sabrina stood at the ritual's edge. She had not been restrained. She had simply arrived too late to matter, which Saravin had clearly calculated as the more elegant solution. Vaelric took in the room in 1 second. In the second after that he crossed it. He did not draw a weapon. He did not address Saravin. He walked to where Sabrina stood and placed himself in front of her and turned to face the ritual with the particular stillness of a man who has finished calculating and arrived at the only remaining option. Then he spoke her name. Not her common name. Her full name in the formal compact language, the old tongue, the words that predated the kingdom that the compact itself was written in. Words that carried no ceremonial weight whatsoever unless the person speaking them meant them without reservation, without political architecture, without the performance of anything. Sabrina Voss. And then the declaration. That she was his. Not the crowns. Not the courts. His, as the beast had chosen and as he chose freely with full knowledge in front of witnesses irrevocably. The ritual stopped. Not dramatically. Not with violence. It simply ceased the way a held breath releases, the magic losing its internal logic the moment the compact's own language contradicted it from inside its own terms. Saravin's composure fractured for the first and only time. She looked at him with the expression of someone watching a calculation fail that had never failed before. Draevor rose. He crossed the room slowly, the glow of his eyes casting gold across the stone floor, and stood beside them. The three of them. And the silence that followed was the same silence as the throne room on the very first day, that specific breathless quality of the impossible occurring in plain sight before witnesses who would spend years trying to find the rational explanation and never quite arrive at one. Saravin's conspiracy did not survive the morning. The documents, the servant's testimony, the archivist's account of the sigil. It assembled quickly once it had direction, the way truth tends to assemble once someone stops managing its pieces. Sabrina stood in the east courtyard the following afternoon with the medallion in her hand and the full weight of her bloodline's meaning finally spoken aloud to her, and she thought about leaving. She considered it honestly the way she had learned to consider things, without self-erasure, without the preemptive shrinking. The road existed. The choice was real. Vaelric found her there. He did not ask the question directly, he did not yet have that language, might not for some time, but he stood beside her and looked at the courtyard gate and waited in a way that was not the waiting of a king expecting compliance. It was the waiting of someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the answer was not his to determine. She looked at the gate for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Then at Draevor, who was watching her with those ancient gold eyes that had seen her clearly from the very first moment, in a throne room that felt like years ago, when she had been a ledger entry given a face and he had looked at her like she was something else entirely. She put the medallion in her pocket. "I'll stay," she said. Not because she had nowhere else to go. That had been the beginning of the story. The version of herself that arrived at these gates with nothing and believed that was the truth of her. She stayed because she chose to. Because the difference between those two things was everything. Vaelric said nothing. But something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the place where warmth might eventually learn to live once a man has spent long enough in its vicinity to stop being afraid of it. Draevor settled between them in the afternoon light. For the first time in his reign, Vaelric Thorne did not know what came next. He stood in that uncertainty and did not move to resolve it. And that, more than anything that had come before it, was the beginning of something true.